Warframe is 12 years old now, and it's still evolving into an amazing game. The game is very abundant now with content, and it's an anomaly considering it's also a free-to-play game. However, we can't deny the fact that not all Warframe updates are banger content, and there are some content that flopped hard in the past. But we are not talking about Railjack here though, as that's a very old news. What I want to talk here is why Digital Extremes considered adding restrictions in the game as the only way to make challenging content in Warframe. This is a hard-to-swallow pill, but I really think that there's no other way to do it without removing the power fantasy of the game. Okay, let me explain my reasoning, beginning with the content that first introduced this restrictive gameplay in Warframe. During release, some Warframe players dislike the Duviri circuit for several reasons, with the biggest issue being the forced randomized loadouts. Unlike the rest of the game, where players invest time and resources into crafting and optimizing their favorite weapons and Warframes, the circuit mode assigns random gear each week. This frustrates players because they are often stuck using underleveled or ineffective equipment, making the experience feel inconsistent and sometimes frustrating, especially for those who prefer specific playstyles. Another major complaint is the sheer time commitment required to progress in the Duviri circuit, particularly in the Steel Path variant. The mode features long mission chains, and failing or leaving early means losing progress, which can be exhausting. Additionally, the random nature of decrees can make some runs feel much harder than others, further adding to player frustration. Lastly, the mode's reliance on the Duviri mechanics and open-world aspects is divisive. While some players enjoy Duviri's unique roguelike mechanics, others find it repetitive, especially when compared to Warframe's traditional fast-paced, power fantasy gameplay. The horseback traversal, melee-focused combat, and constant decree resets can feel disconnected from the core game. Combined with the often unpredictable difficulty spikes and occasional bugs, these factors lead some players to avoid the Duviri circuit altogether, despite its exclusive rewards. Now, some players thought we won't see another Duviri circuit gameplay again, because it was considered by some as a big flop. But then comes the Netracell missions. Unlike other mission types that offer varied objectives and fast-paced gameplay, Netracells require players to complete a series of tasks within the mission, often involving an extermination. It's really not a problem with the current meta, and you can use Wukong to traverse the map easily. However, some feels like the time investment is not good enough for its rewards. Aside from the mission, you'll be inflicted with debuffs that may slow down your progress. Enemies are also tough, and there's no respawn in this mission. If you are playing solo, then you'll need to restart the whole mission again. After finishing the mission, you only get a chance to obtain the 2 legendary arcanes, namely Melee Crescendo and Melee Duplicate, or you can get a Tau-forged Archon Shard, or a normal shard in the end. The Melee arcanes are not universal, and they only work well in specific Warframe and weapon combos. They do sell for a hefty amount of platinum at max rank, but it would take weeks or even months just to complete one max rank legendary melee arcane. In most cases, you'll get Archon Shards, which is really good for maximizing the potential of your builds, but it's not necessary to have in your setup. After the Netracell mission, Digital Extremes upgraded this and combined it with some feature of the Duviri circuit. We now have the Deep Archimedia, and the elite version of this will give us better chances of getting Tau-forged Archon Shards, and as well as melee arcanes. But now, you'll not only get hindered by debuffs, but you will also be limited to using specific loadouts if you want to get the highest possible rewards of the game mode. When this game mode arrived, a lot of players complained because it was too hard. However, the real issue was not the challenge offered by the game mode, but players don't have all their items at max levels with upgraded builds to do the elite Deep Archimedia. Honestly, I'm one of those players that don't have all Warframes and weapons upgraded to do elite Deep Archimedia back then, but I did not complain simply because the game mode is meant for players who have maxed out most of their loadout and want a more challenging experience in the game. There's the Netracell mission if you can't do elite Deep Archimedia. And it does give the same rewards, except for Vosphor drops and slightly better drop chance of items that are also obtainable in Netracell missions. Digital Extremes introduced game modes like Deep Archimedia in Warframe to offer a more challenging experience for veteran players who have mastered the game's power fantasy. Over the years, Warframe has evolved into a game where players wield near godlike strength, thanks to overpowered weapons, Warframe abilities, and highly optimized builds. Standard missions no longer pose a real threat, as players can obliterate enemies in seconds with devastating area of effect attacks or invincibility mechanics. The only way to make the game challenging is to force players into strict conditions, limiting their usual arsenal and making them rely on skill rather than sheer power. This approach is similar to taking away a superhero's strongest abilities to see how well they can fight with just their wits and basic tools. Imagine if Superman had to complete a mission without his flight, heat vision, or super strength. Suddenly, he'd have to think more strategically, using his brain cells rather than brute force. The only solution, without breaking the game, is to strip away the most broken weapons and Warframe synergies. And this can create a scenario where players must carefully engage with enemies, manage resources, and make meaningful tactical decisions. Ultimately, these restrictive game modes serve as a way to keep Warframe engaging for long-time players who might otherwise feel invincible. Without limitations, the game can become a power fantasy with no real difficulty, reducing the sense of achievement. But despite the limitations imposed by these game modes, I still can see a future wherein Duviri Circuit, Netracell's missions, and Deep Archimedia will just be normal missions in the game. Every update, we gain power, and in fact, I think only a small portion of the community complains that these missions are hard right now. Players don't consider these game modes as challenging, but instead, they are just part of the weekly farm to get platinum, just like the other so-called challenging game modes that has been added in the past. The missions may be hard for those who just started building their overpowered warframes and weapons, but for those veteran players, these missions are just another day at the office. In fact, we will be receiving Temporal Archimedia next patch, which is a version of Warframe 1999 Deep Archimedia. So far, I haven't seen any angry mobs complaining about it, and many are interested about the upcoming arcanes it will reward. Based from what we saw in the recent dev stream also, the randomness of the rewards is gone, and we now have the option to pick the reward that we want in this new Temporal Archimedia. This is what Digital Extremes always do, and they test out new systems, then make changes depending on player feedbacks. Because of this also, the challenge on the new game modes is removed, and it's just an endless loop now of adding new game modes that limits power fantasy, but then gets fixed a couple of months to make it farming friendly.